Tonight's presenter will share from Kentucky's fascinating past, focusing on two courageous leaders, Governor A.O. Stanley and Ned Breathitt. Our speaker has served in several capacities, including public defender, circuit court judge, and in his current position in Kentucky's highest court. He's the author of Castle, the story of a Kentucky prison, On Bended Knees, the true story of the Night Rider Tobacco War, Flames in the Wind, and Children of Promise. We're pleased to have as our guest tonight Supreme Court Justice Bill Cunningham.
Thank you, Bobby. Thank you, Bobby, and good evening. These are always exciting times. I've been here several times, about to run out of books. Maybe I'll do a rerun or something, but it's always a lot of fun. It's really good to be among friends. Socrates says it's good to be among friends, Andrew, even if they're not yours. It's even better to be among friends that are yours. I mean, I'm looking at people in this room. They go back a long way. I won't say how long, but I have a high school classmate, Philip Morgan, back there. Tells you how far we go back. Good to see Philip and so many others. He's probably heard me talk before, so must be looking for a night out real bad if he comes down here tonight. But he is and Bobby Wrinkle does such a wonderful job with these, and I guess give Bobby a good time. I don't know if it was last month, a couple months ago, I was here for Andy Angelo and A Dark Highway, and I want to put another plug in for her book. That's a great book. If you hadn't had a chance to read it, if you were here, you know Andy did a great job with that. So it's good to be back to here tonight. This book I want to talk to you tonight about is the latest of the books I've written, and they all deal with West Kentucky, except for Kentucky's Clark, which is kind of an interview format for Kentucky's distinguished historian, Dr. Thomas D. Clark. But these books were all about West Kentucky. I started writing them out of a certain paranoia. All of us that come from West Kentucky, west of the Green River, are a little bit paranoid. We feel like that we get left out of the rest of the state. We realize that they don't pay much attention to us. Some of them even call us the territory. They still think the maps are uncharted down here. And so they really don't know much of our history. They didn't realize, never heard of the Black Patch War, the biggest, greatest civil uprising in America between the Civil War and the race riots of the 60s, happened right here at the back of farmers, the Night Riders. They don't realize that on a 10-acre tract of land over here in Lyon County is one of the most dramatic, historic plots of ground anywhere in this state, at the Kentucky State Penitentiary, you name it, everything's happened there, including our last 166 executions in this state. And the night I'm going to talk to you about, to me, probably one of the most dramatic events to ever happen in Kentucky as far as raw courage, violence, and sheer heroism. And it happened right here in West Kentucky. And I'm glad we got some friends from over at Murray. Murray and Paducah, Hopkinsville, we all have a connection with this story. And it's one of the most dramatic stories. I have my own Bend the Knee book with a Hollywood agent trying to market that book for a film out there. I don't think it'll get done because it would be such a epic proportions as far as cost that Hollywood doesn't like those big budgets anymore. But this is a story that I could see made into a movie because it could almost be made on Universal Studios' back lot. All you need is a fake train and a courtroom and a fake hotel, and it pretty well tells the street, maybe a few, tells the story, maybe a few streets. So let's go back to the winter of 1916. It's a cold December Saturday. Temperature was in the 20s down here at Murray, Kentucky. How many of you are familiar? I know Mr. Patterson, the ones back there, are very familiar. How many of you are very familiar with Murray? Okay, we ought to be. Everybody ought to be. Great community. So I'm going to relate to you exactly where this took place so you can relate to it today. But on that evening, on that December evening in 1916, the temperature was hovering around 20 degrees. Guthrie Dugan was a white former town marshal, was shot dead by Lou Martin, a local black man. Dugan was also a farmer out on the north side of town. out around where the Murray Cemetery is, out in that area. And he was walking into town. He had a farm. I think he was walking back into town around noontime. He was walking down Curd Street. Curd Street is what is now 4th Street, as you know. There's a main drag going in front of the judicial building there into town. Used to be the main way to go into Murray. He was walking down there when he met Lube Martin and 2 of Lube's brothers and a friend from out of town. There had been bad blood between Guthrie Duguid and Lube Martin for a long time. Lube had filed a complaint with the city council against Duguid when he had been deputy marshal in Murray, alleging that Duguid had been making sexual advances toward his wife. Well, there was enough credibility in that affidavit, and Lube Martin had enough credibility and apparently corroborated enough that it ended up getting Duguid fired from his job. And when that happened, for several months, Duguid had been hounding Lube Martin, trying and through threatening him into going up and taking the affidavit back and disclaiming that anything had ever happened between him and Lube Martin's wife. So on this day, it's chance encounter by Duguid going into town, Lube Martin and his friends coming north. They came together in a fateful encounter. Words were exchanged, heated words were exchanged. A scuffle ensued, and Lube Martin pulled a pistol and shot at Duguid 4 times. 2 of them hitting the mark, 1 in the chest and the other in the left shoulder. The 4 blacks then ran north, out Curd Street, which is out North Street. While Duguid was staggering, turned out to be mortally wounded, managed to get a man who was in a livery rig coming out this town to take him uptown to the doctor's office of Dr. Mason, who had his doctor's office there on the 2nd floor around the Court Square in Murray. He got on board the livery rig, and they rushed him into town. Several men were there to take him out of the rig and carried him up the steps to Dr. Mason's office. This was a winter Saturday. The town was bustling with farmers. You all remember what Saturday afternoon in town used to be. Wintertime especially, because the farmers had the crops laid by or gone, as I said, midwinter. Big crowd there, and they all became concerned and all came around the doctor's office to see how badly Duguid was wounded. The doctor's office was that of Rob and Will Mason. Now, the 4 black men, including Lube Martin, headed north. But Lube Martin did something that would spare his life, probably, for that time being. Instead of continuing on north, continuing off to the west, he looped back down to the right. We remember, many of us remember, when at that corner there was a tobacco warehouse there. That tobacco warehouse stood there for a long time there on the corner of Chestnut Street and what is now 4th Street. He looped to the right, heading back down the hill toward the railroad track. Then turned south and kind of just looped around town. He came south probably because that was the black section of town. That area is. It's where he thought he could find some safe haven by going down that way. But he basically just looped around while the people up in town, hearing about Guthrie Duguid being shot and hearing about Lube Martin's brothers being involved in it, pretty much automatically formed a mob to go looking for Lube Martin and his brother. Sheriff Will Patterson have his grandson with him today. Stand up. Stand up. I got a mental block. Your name? Randy. Randy. I know that your father was named Randall, too, as well. So I get that mixed up. Randy Patterson from Murray. This was his grandfather, Sheriff Will Patterson. He and his deputies were joined by a growing crowd of what was quickly a mob and gave hunt to the 4 fugitives. Miraculously, 3 of them were apprehended and safely locked in jail without mishap. But Martin, as I said, had ran north on Curd Street, looped back around, and by the time they get out to the area where this incident happened, he was already down the railroad track walking toward Tennessee. And by the time darkness began to fall upon Murray, Martin had made his getaway and was a good distance from town, down around the Hazel area. Seething and frustrated, the mob finally gave up the chase and returned to the court square. There, they gathered their families, climbed into their trucks, cars, and wagons, and began heading home. And they left the manhunt for Lou Martin in the hands of their able sheriff, Will Patterson. The next day was Sunday, December 10th. As the 60-year-old Duguid held desperate to life, Sheriff Patterson was working the phones, calling all law enforcement agencies in West Kentucky and West Tennessee, putting them on notice for a lookout for the fugitive Lou Martin. Late on that Sunday afternoon, two more very pivotal things happened in this whole story. First, at the Murray Hospital, Guthrie Duguid died from the gunshot wounds. So Lou Martin now was wanted for murder. At the same time, almost, Will Patterson received a critical phone call from Humboldt, Tennessee, reporting that they had his man. They had apprehended Lou Martin in Henry, Tennessee, when he was recognized by a railroad employee. He was in custody and requested that Will Patterson and his deputies come and bring him back. So, being late in the day, Sheriff Patterson waited to the next morning and picked his ablest and strongest deputy, Felix Bailey, and made plans to proceed to Humboldt, Tennessee the next day to apprehend Lou Martin. We began to pick up a little bit at this stage on the good common sense that those country sheriffs had in that day. Because when Patterson, besides being tough, he was also pretty smart. As he and Bailey made their way south to Humboldt, they made a wise decision. There was still a lot of tension rising in Murray. There were still people gathering together, waiting for them to bring Lou Martin back to Murray. He saw and he knew a lynch mob when he saw one. So to thwart this possibility, they decided to take Martin across country to Hopkinsville and lodge him in Hopkinsville, Kentucky for safekeeping rather than bringing him back to Murray. Well, when the eager throng waiting down at the Murray Depot heard about the deception, it grew angry and it demanded swift justice. The outcry was so great that Circuit Judge Charles Bush, who lived over in Hopkinsville, sent word that he would agree to come to Murray. The lynch mob would dispel and dispense with itself. He would agree to come to Murray the following Wednesday, December 13th, and to speak at a meeting of the outraged citizens. So that quelled the uprising at that point, and they awaited Judge Bush to come over on December 13th. Lou Martin, meanwhile, was being kept in the Hopkinsville jail. So Bush came the following Wednesday. He assured the crowd that they were going to convene a special term of court in January. They were going to have Lou Martin indicted. They were going to bring him back to trial. They held trial in January, and their pursuit of justice would be satisfied. And that's what he did. So at that stage, up through Christmas, up to the first of the year, it was a peaceful scene in Murray when it regards to Lou Martin and this whole incident. Then, on Monday, January the 8th, 1917, at a special session of the Callaway County Circuit Court, Judge Bush was as good as his word, impounded a grand jury which quickly indicted Lou Martin for murder. His trial, David Sparks, my good friend, lawyer here, former district attorney for a federal court in Paducah, we really love this. He set the murder trial 2 days later for Lou Martin. He's going to get swift justice in this case because Murray people are all over the courthouse wanting, not so sure they wanted justice so much as they wanted vengeance. So on Tuesday evening, before the trial was supposed to begin on Wednesday, Lou Martin was brought back to Murray for his trial the following day. Now, Judge Bush appointed a lawyer there in Murray by the name of Pat Holt to represent Lou Martin. Denny Smith was the Commonwealth attorney, and imagine what kind of challenge Pat Holt, his lawyer, had. He was going to see his client for the first time the night before the trial started the next day. Now, in that day, keep in mind, in that day, 1960, 1970, all the way up into the 20s, the roads were bad in West Kentucky. So when we say McCracken Circuit Court, and we say Line Circuit Court, and we say Caldwell Circuit Court, it was indeed a circuit. They rode the circuit. They took a train. Judge Bush and Denny Smith had 5 counties in their circuit. They had Callaway, they had Christian, they had Line, and they had Trigg. Callaway, Line, Christian, Trigg, and I feel like I'm leaving one out. I thought he had 5 counties. But anyway, he had a large district. And then they had to do this traveling by train. Now, in 1917, how did you get across the rivers? East of what? You went across the rivers, you went across the Cumberland River at Canton on a ferry. You went across the Tennessee River down at Fenton, over into Marshall County on the Agnes Ferry ferry. There were no bridges, but there were railroad bridges. The railroads had bridges, but no bridges there. Railroad trip from Hopkinsville to Paducah in that time, to Murray at that time, had to go to Paducah first, catch the exchange, and then come to Murray. There was the only railroad bridge was down at Giversville. You know the railroad bridge down at Giversville below Kentucky Dam? It's almost exactly in the same location as the very first railroad bridge was. Been moved once, but then it was moved back. Pretty much the same location. That's the train that Judge Bush would have to take from Hopkinsville to Princeton, exchange on the train, go to Paducah, change the train to Paducah, if he came by train to Murray. If he came by car, which was not very predictable, you still had the ferries, you still had the high water, you still had the muddy roads. So trains were the most dependable way of traveling. But they brought Lou Martin back. He had him in jail, ready to go to trial on Wednesday, the following day, January the 10th. And as I said, they traveled in circuits, which means that the circuit judge, the Commonwealth attorney, the lawyers pretty well were all there all the time. The judge and this Commonwealth attorney would be put up in the local hotel, and they would conduct court business pretty well around the clock. So when Lou Martin came to Murray that night, and Pat Holt had a chance to talk to him, he went down and talked to Denny Smith, and they probably had Judge Bush there as well, and he made a very reasonable request. What do you think that request was? I need a continuance. I have witnesses. Denny Smith, being a fair-minded Commonwealth attorney, understood that. Of course, you need a continuance. Judge Bush agreed to it. So they agreed to continue the case until a later date, which satisfied Pat Holt. It also satisfied Denny Smith, and of course, it was the wise decision to make. However, the next morning, when trial was beginning to start, the jurors began to gather, onlookers packed into the courtroom, expecting a trial of Lou Martin. Lou Martin was not there. Lou Martin was not going to be tried that day. And they became upset and became very loud and boisterous. Became so angry and they became so violent that when Denny Smith and Judge Bush tried to make their way back to the old Murray Hotel there, they got pushed around and shoved. And the mob formed and followed them all the way to the hotel and gathered in the lobby of the old Murray Hotel there, demanding that Judge Bush bring Lou Martin back to Murray immediately for trial. Now, where was Lou Martin? Again, Sheriff Patterson, pretty smart. When he heard about this continuance that night, he knew that all hell was going to break loose the next morning. So he went over to jail. He packed Lou Martin up, and him and another deputy walked. This is like 3 o'clock in the morning. He walked Lou Martin all the way out to Almo. Y'all know where Almo is, to catch the train back to Paducah and back to Hopkinsville. So Lou Martin was safe, but Judge Bush and Denny Smith were in a peck of trouble because they were the subjects of a lynch mob which would basically take them, and threatened to hang Judge Bush if he didn't order Lou Martin returned to Murray. Judge Bush and Danny Smith were together in a hotel room, basically in prison, being kept prisoners in the hotel. Judge Bush held his ground, refused to order it done. So the mob stayed there and kept demanding, they better bring him back or we're going to hang you. He held firm, though, but as the day wore on, it became a grim standoff. The restless and irritated mass of citizens milling around the hotel began to wear Judge Bush down. Judge Bush was not a spring chicken at that time. He was an older man. And finally, in mid-afternoon, Bush relented. He sent word out to bring Martin back to Murray. Now, what went on to change Judge Bush's mind? We don't know for sure, but we know that there were several people in Murray, people who were very well respected, had political pull. We know one of them was Rainey T. Wells, first president of Murray State. He was a close associate, friend of all political office holders, including Judge Bush. We know they came down to the hotel room. We know they talked to Judge Bush. They tried to figure out some way to save Judge Bush and Denny Smith while at the same time not have lynch violence. So I think they talked Judge Bush, assured him that we'll make sure this mob is at bay, and we will not allow mob violence if you order him back. Whatever reason, Judge Bush ordered him back. So word went out by telegraph, by telephone, to catch up with Patterson to bring Lou Martin, his prisoner, back to Murray. Well, I often think about Will Patterson. By this time, the word caught up with Will Patterson, bring the prisoner back. You know where he was? He'd been traveling all day. This is late afternoon. He was just down getting to Princeton. He was just getting ready to put Lou Martin on the train at Princeton for the last leg to Hopkinsville when they came out. Wait a minute, Sheriff. You got a telephone call in here. You're supposed to bring your prisoner back to Murray. I'd give anything to know, Randy, what your grandfather went through his mind about that time. He'd been up all night probably. He had saved Lou Martin from the lynch mob by walking to Alamo, got him on a train, traveled most of the day, was in Princeton, almost had his job completed. And what happened? He wants him to take him back to Murray. Being a good sheriff, obeying the court order, he put Lou Martin back on the train, headed back to Murray. Well, fate was kind to everybody on that day, because by the time that Patterson and his deputy and Lou Martin reached Paducah here, down at the Union Station, Littleville, down in this Littleville action of Paducah, where many of us remember when that old depot down there. When they got back here, the last train for Murray for the day had just departed. So he'd have to lodge his prisoner here in Paducah and wait and take him back the next day. So there we have the setting. Darkness is falling on Paducah on that winter night of January 10th, 1917. You got a lynch mob over at Murray in the hotel holding Judge Bush and Denny Smith hostage until they get Lou Martin back. Lou Martin, for the time being, is safely tucked away in the city jail here in Paducah. Hopefully, Will Patterson is getting some sleep. And that's what was happening here on the western end of the state, but not in Louisville, Kentucky, and not at the Silbach Hotel. At the Silbach Hotel that night, A.O. Stanley, the governor of Kentucky, was in a session with some of his legislative aides. This sounds familiar to you. They were planning for the upcoming legislative session, and the topic was tax reform. Nothing's ever new, is it? They were talking about tax reform. Well, telephone, of course, was in play at that time. Telephone calls started coming in. We got a big problem, Governor, down in Murray. They got, believe it or not, they got Judge Bush down there, the lynch mob, holding him hostage until he brings a black prisoner back from Hopkinsville, Kentucky, and they're probably going to hang. But he didn't believe it at first. And then a good, solid Paducah Circuit judge by the name of W.M. Reed got through to him on the telephone, and Judge Reed and the governor knew each other, and he could trust Reed. He got to him on the telephone and said, "I'm afraid to say, Governor, it's true. You've got Judge Bush and Denny Smith, Livingston Pearl, the lynch mob's holding him at the hotel in Murray." So, there he was, the governor of Kentucky. He got a telephone call. Lynch mob's got a circuit judge holding hostage in Murray, Kentucky. What are you going to do? The governor thinks they got their problems today. Here's a big problem. Of course, you say, of course, we know what to do. We call in the state militia. We call in the National Guard. We get them there immediately. Problem solved, right? It would have been, except he did not have a state militia. He did not have a National Guard. They were off down the Mexican border chasing Pancho Villa. He had no army. He had no police force. He had nothing. So, what to do? Well, he told his aides, "We have got to go to Murray." They must have thought he was crazy. He said, "We've got to go to Murray, and we've got to go get there quick." Well, another nice circumstance happened that night. Right down below the suite that the governor had there at the Silbach, and the Silbach had only been open for about 2 or 3 years at that time, the Transportation Club of Louisville was holding its annual banquet. And you know what the Transportation Club of Louisville was? It was basically sponsoring a big gala with the cloth tablecloths, the wine flowing freely, the silverware, nice festive occasion. They were the railroad moguls of the southeastern United States and the railroad moguls of Kentucky. They began to get word of this crisis brewing upstairs with the governor and this problem in Murray. And they got word that the governor needed to go to Murray. They all huddled together and said, "No problem." They get out to the Littleton Yard, which that's what the Louisville train station was called too, and they put together a special train. They cleared all the lines and put him on an express about midnight for Murray, Kentucky. And A.O. Stanley, and I've always had a great admiration for those 3 or 4 aides that went with him, offered their assistance to go to Murray with him. So at midnight, Governor Stanley and 3 gallant members of his entourage boarded the train and headed out through the night to the far reaches of West Kentucky. They traveled through the night, and in my book, Distant Light, I try to speculate what went on in that train. If I could go back in time to any one time in Kentucky history, I think I'd want to be on that train. I'd like to know what they talked about. I'd like to know what the strategy was. I'd like to know what these aides are trying to talk. What are you going to do, Governor? What are you going to do? I doubt that they slept very much. But they passed down through the night all these historic places they went by. They went very close to Racine, Kentucky, where little Bill Monroe was sleeping away in his family home. Passed on down past Mineral Mound, the place of Willis Matchin up in Lyon County. Passed on down across the Tennessee River, all the way into Paducah. And they arrived in Paducah just about daylight. And A.O. Stanley, they had to make a train switch. He got off and was going to have breakfast while they're making the train switch. And another good circumstance that time. Guess who was also at the train station at the same time that the governor arrived? Will Patterson with Lou Martin, getting ready to get on the same train that the governor's going, not the same train, but on the train to take Lou Martin back to Murray. And the governor called him there and said, no, you're not going back to Murray. You're going back to Hopkinsville. You're going back to Hopkinsville. You give me Felix Bailey, I'll take Bailey with me. You can take Lou Martin back by yourself. And here's old Patterson, Will Patterson again, getting back on the train, trudging back to Hopkinsville. My guess, he was really a happy man that morning to take him back to Murray. So Patterson's taking Lou Martin. We got Lou Martin taken care of. And so he decided to take Bailey with him on to Murray. They ran down to Murray, down through Sharp, Benton, and then finally came into Murray. And there's a crowd, and the train station at Murray, of course, is the same place as it is today. It's not used anymore. I think they got Randy, they have a museum there now or something in the old train station at Murray, or do you know?
Part of it is
Yeah.
but part of it is still there.
Well, it knows where it's located. It's just down the hill from downtown, from the courthouse, the old courthouse there in Murray. So a crowd of over 300 people were awaiting the governor when he arrived at the depot in Murray. 300 people. Now, most of them were friendly, glad to see the state's chief executive coming to hopefully bail their community out of a potentially disastrous and highly embarrassing situation. Let me say this about A.O. Stanley. If there's going to be a politician to come to Murray, Kentucky, if there's going to be a politician to come rescue Lou Martin, there could not have been a better, more popular person than A.O. Stanley. People loved A.O. Stanley because he went to bat for the tobacco farmers. He got the owner's tobacco tax repeal. The tobacco farmers loved him. I remember my dad talking about how much his father loved A.O. Stanley. So he's very popular. And he was met at the train station with many friends and supporters. I saw the vote return in Callaway County on his election for governor. He only won the governorship by 400 votes against Edward Morrow that time he won. But, I mean, in Callaway County, it was like 100 to 1 almost. So he had some friends, a lot of friends there. And they were at the depot, and they were glad to see him. He met with them, and then he began to make his way up the hill to the Murray Hotel, which was there on Main Street, right behind what was, I guess later became the bank building, right down from the courthouse. And then as he began to get into the area of the Murray Hotel where the mob had formed, he began to run into the edges of the lynch mob, and the water started to turn muddy. These people were not friendly. They not only were not friendly to Judge Bush, they weren't going to be friendly to anybody that came to help Judge Bush. They weren't going to be friendly to anybody who came without Lou Martin with them. So who is that guy? You'd ask, who is that guy come marching through? A.O. Stanley was a brilliant, confident, aggressive type person. And when he was told that he was the governor of Kentucky, the man coldly replied, "Well, he doesn't look any bigger than Judge Bush to me." So with some difficulty, Stanley shouldered his way in, finally through the gathering, into the hotel and up to the room where Bush and Smith were located. Of course, they were elated to see the governor. Their spirits sunk, however, when they learned that Stanley had not brought with him the Negro. They thought that by bringing Lou Martin back, that their plight was sealed. Some of the political supporters of both Bush and Stanley were in the room trying to devise a suitable way to get out of this situation. And Rainy T. Wells was one of those people. In fact, Rainy T. Wells came up with the idea, maybe we ought to get a car right up front of the hotel, and we'll grab them and make a mad dash down, throw them in the car, and then make their way to the train station, or maybe even out of town. Well, A.O. Stanley wisely thought that was a harebrained idea. He knew these men in that lynch mob. He knew them of their mentality. He knew of their culture. He knew from which they came from. This is 1917. Some of them had been night riders. Their fathers had fought at Chickamauga, at Vicksburg, at Shiloh. These were tough men. They weren't to be trifled with. They weren't to try to be hoodwinked. It could only exacerbate the situation if they tried a trick like that. So Stanley, the local leaders, Rainy T. Wells, all in this room, and of course poor old Judge Bush had already had to have a doctor call because he looked like a used bar of soap. He was in a bad way, and they were trying to devise a way out of this dilemma. Now, you know, the governor's kind of made himself a prisoner now. So he thought about it, and finally A.O. Stanley made a very dramatic decision, and one that had brilliance in it when we think about it and we look at it. He said, we're going to go to court. What do you mean go to court? Yeah, we're going to go to court. Let's go to the courtroom. Get everybody, go tell them we're going to go to court. Follow us up to the courtroom. So they started announcing, the governor said, and the judge, we're all going back to court. We're all going to the courtroom. So here they went, Judge Bush, Denny Smith, the governor, leading the way, marking down the street into the old Murray courthouse, which is still there. It's the old county courthouse. It's not the judicial building anymore, but it's where the county office is, that very same courthouse. Upstairs, the courtroom. And the mob followed them in the courtroom. And A.O. Stanley put Judge Bush up on the bench where the judge is supposed to be, not cowering away in his hotel room, up on the bench. Sense of authority. He's up above. He's up there. He's setting the decorum, see? It's a courtroom scene, not a mob scene anymore. It's a courtroom scene with people out in the courtroom. And the judge is sitting on the bench. The Commonwealth attorney is sitting at his table. He's setting the scene. The beaten old jurist climbed up on the bench. The old courtroom was packed, every nook and cranny, all the way up to the far reaches of the balcony. And I had the pleasure of trying one of the last cases tried in that old courtroom. Prosecutor, sheriff over there. I won't say more about that. But the governor took his place in the jury box, standing in the jury box, facing the horde. He stood there silently peering out over the buzzing and expecting crowd. Now, I think they probably thought he was going to say, "Cool it, guys. We've got a sheriff going to get Lou Martin right now, so we're going to have a trial here after a while." That's what they probably expected, but that's not what he told them. Here's what he told them. This noted orator, and was one of the greatest ones, known for his ringing eloquence, elevating quotations, and phrases of persuasion, proceeded to give the speech of his life. The newspapers account, and I'm not making this up, this is right out of the newspapers. The newspapers the next day would give an almost word-for-word account of what he said. He bragged on Callaway County, good Dale Carnegie technique, right? He bragged on Callaway County, talked about what a great community it was, a fine, upstanding people, and how he had been welcomed there in their homes many times. But he chastised them for being part of an activity of taking the law into their own hands. They reminded the oath he took as governor, as I hoped upheld the law. I'll see that the laws are enforced and enforced with vigor. I'll protect that Negro from mob violence, and before I let you hang that Negro, you will have to hang me. He beseeched them to return home to their wives and children and say that the governor of Kentucky has said he would preserve this law with respect even if it cost him his own life. As he spoke, the congregation grew as quiet as a midnight cemetery. Heads began to nod in agreement. At least once there was applause. The mood slowly but assuredly shifted, and actually a few of them in the rear of the courtroom began to slip out the back door. He shamed them. He turned the spotlight of guilt upon their faces. And finally, he concluded, "Now I appeal to you in the names of your mothers, our wives and children, and the dignity of the Commonwealth of Kentucky and the Most High God, to assist this governor and this circuit judge in the maintenance of law and order." Well, the sore had been lanced. The venom had been drained from the bulging cyst of anarchy and violence. Judge Bush then announced the court's going to go into recess. We'll be back out with an announcement. Him and Judge Bush and Denny Smith went into recess. They came out a few minutes later, and not as many people there when they came back out. And they announced that there would be a trial date for Lou Martin in February. So, the mob began to move out of that courtroom. They recessed the court. As the army of would-be vigilantes began to make their way out of the courtroom, Stanley quickly escorted Bush and Smith down the stairs. Now, I've been down those steps out of that old courthouse. They're narrow. He took them out the back way, down the stairs, down to the Murray Hotel, got their gathered their goods and stuff. And a few well-wishers were at the depot when they got there to see them off. Bush and Smith wasted no time of getting on the train. But the gregarious governor stayed around and pumped a few more hands. And then he hopped on the train and waved to the engine and said, "Ready to go." And finally the train was ready to move. He hopped on it and waved, and they were off. A shrill scream, a whistle cleared the throat of the awakening beast, and the huge wheels, rods, and pistons began to churn, picking up steam. And within a few minutes, the train was hitting its stride northward. It flew to Paducah, fires burning, white smoke pouring from the stack, sparks flying, kicking up cinders, with Judge Charles Bush and Commonwealth Attorney Denny Smith safely tucked aboard. Well, it was pretty dramatic, as I've just told you. The next day, after it hit the newspapers, it was all over the country. Newspapers were being bannered, headlines all across the country, bannering the heroics of A.O. Stanley. A lot of people portraying him as the next candidate for President of the United States. He was overnight a national hero. A Southern governor defending a black man charged with murder of a white man in 1917 was pretty heroic in itself. Going to actually and putting himself at physically risk of harm, possibly death, to save that individual was very, very extraordinary. That's a very dramatic part of the story. It's told in a distant light. I go on in the story to tell about the eventual trial of Lou Martin. I tell it from a perspective of an old trial lawyer myself and trial judge myself, trying to superimpose myself in trying that case in 1970, and Judge Bush did. Came back and tried the case in Murray. Pat Holt moved that a Christian County jury be brought over to hear the case, which was he only got it half right. He should have asked David to take the case to Christian County. He got a Christian County jury, but it's a puzzle to this day why Pat Holt, and if you read that transcript, Pat Holt did a really good job defending Lou Martin. You read the transcript, Charles Bush did a pretty even-handed job of trying it, made some real critical mistakes in that trial. But why Pat Holt did not move it to Christian County, we will not know, I don't guess, because all the lips have been sealed by death. They would know the answer to that question. I have a guess, and I bet any lawyer who hears this story will have a guess. Guthrie Duguid, people knew Guthrie Duguid was probably guilty of messing around with Lou Martin's wife. That's probably true. Pat Holt probably knew it, and he probably knew the community knew it. He thought, if I take it to Christian County, nobody will know. And even though you have a Christian County jury coming over, they have a way of sensing those things. So he might have thought maybe it'd be best to try it here in Murray, when we're the town that knew Guthrie Duguid. Whatever the reason was, it was probably a bad mistake, because when you think about it, those 55 Christian County jurors that were trained over there to try this case, you're getting out of the train, you're going up there in that courtroom, and this town is still seething to the point where the courtroom is packed, and you've read in the paper of what happened in Murray, that they'd taken the judge hostage, and you're the jury coming over there now to try this case. How are you going to feel? You're a little bit intimidated. So it was a critical move, and it probably it proved pivotal in the case. But anyway, he was convicted. I'm in a quandary as to how much to tell you about the rest of the book, but I'm going to plow on a little bit, and we'll open it for questions. He was convicted and sentenced to death, and he was taken to Edible and was there on death row as his appeals played out. There was a lot of support for Lou Martin, and this is one of the murky areas of this whole story. We don't know where that support came from, but we know he had support in that community. We know that people there knew that a misjudgment had been made, a miscarriage of justice had been taking place. Maybe he should have been guilty of manslaughter, for murder, death penalty. No. We know because somebody in Kentucky began to employ some high-powered people to represent him on appeal. The lawyer they picked, this is ironic, many of the players that played roles in this who went to Lou Martin's defense were either Confederate veterans or they were the sons of Confederate veterans. A.O. Stanley's father was a Confederate soldier. Pat Holt's father was a Confederate soldier. And then they selected to Representative the Honorable Bennett H. Young. And I can say just a little bit about him. You could write a book. I would be, Bob, I'd be kind of intrigued to write a book about Bennett H. Young because he was an interesting person. He was a Confederate soldier, and he was in John Hunt Morgan's raids, and in his group, he was taken prisoner and was in a prison in Ohio. He escaped, went to Canada, and came up with the idea, why don't we attack the Union troops in the north from Canada? He went by ship back to the south. He got approval to take guys up to Canada, and they formed the St. Albans Raid by coming from Canada into Connecticut, took over town, robbed the bank, and they were going to rob northern banks and get money to help support the Confederate treasury. They got caught. Canada, they tried to extradite him back from Canada. Canada refused to extradite him back, but after the war, he became a fugitive because the Confederate leaders were not allowed in unless they had a partner or they're going to be prosecuted. So he traveled overseas, went to Europe, went to the College of Edinburgh, got an education. He got a law degree, and finally, when he was pardoned in 1868, came back to Kentucky, went to Louisville, Kentucky, became a distinguished lawyer. And then he became involved in a very distinguished lawyer, made a lot of money, and he became very involved in charitable organizations. He started and led in establishing the Colored Orphans Home in Louisville, 1879, for black orphans, president of that for 25 years. He established and promoted the Booker T. Washington Community College for blacks, for the welfare of improving race relations. He took many pro bono cases for Afro-Americans. They were too poor to obtain his other services. He has served as the finance manager of the Presbyterian School for Orphan Girls in Anchorage, on and on and on. And he also became very successful with the Louisville Railroad. He also came to the aid, loaned money to save the Louisville Free Public Library. That community and the community became indebted to him. He was also very active in Confederate Veterans Affairs, leading fundraisers, becoming the commandant of the Kentucky Confederate Veterans Association, and led the fundraising drive to get money to build the Jefferson Davis Monument in Fairview. He was instrumental in that. And he, Mr. Confederate soldier, was the one they got to argue for Lou Martin before Kentucky Supreme Court. And argue he did. He represented Lou Martin before the Supreme Court. Supreme Court of Kentucky, they affirmed the conviction. And then I'd like to tell you there's a happy ending to this, folks, but there's not. I guess that's life, isn't it? We all who deal in this arena of human tragedy find out that they don't always end like they do on TV. Lou had some bad luck. A.O. Stanley, who might very well have pardoned him, or at least commuted his sentence, in 1917, had an opportunity. Ollie James, who was a United States Senator over at Marion, who was an up and rising star in Kentucky politics, Bob, you may have heard of him, died suddenly at the age of 47. So A.O. Stanley resigned. His Lieutenant Governor Black appointed A.O. Stanley to the U.S. Senate, and Black became governor. So in July of 1919, when Lou Martin was scheduled to be executed at Kentucky State Penitentiary, his last hope had moved to Washington, D.C. A.O. Stanley was no longer the governor of Kentucky. Governor Black was. Now, we don't like the end of this story. I wish I could change it, but I'd be telling you a lie if I did. There's some things that we'll never know about this case. There was some support. Lou Martin was scheduled to die on July the 5th. My dates may not be exactly, in 1919. There were some others scheduled to die during that period of time, and Black did not pardon him. But he issued a stay of execution for Lou Martin, saying that some prominent citizens of Murray, Kentucky, had made several trips to Frankfort on behalf of the condemned, and he wanted an opportunity to review the record more. So we know there are 3 or 4 trips made to Frankfort, Kentucky by some prominent citizens of Murray to try to save Lou Martin. We don't know their names. We don't know who they were. We also know there were some substantial people involved in helping him by getting a man like Bennett Young to represent him on appeal. There was some efforts. Names we don't know. Whatever we don't know. Frustrating thing about writing this book, 1917 was 100 years ago. Long time for us. But in the grand scheme of things, when I was writing it, there were people living, even today, who may have heard their parents talking about it. I had a 101-year-old cousin over in Callaway County, Mrs. Parker, who's living out close to Pine Bluff, Patterson, McChristian, Cunningham area of Callaway County. She never heard of it. We failed to find any primary source that could talk about it. We went to the black community over in Murray. We talked to Lou Martin's people. We talked to his daughters, to his grandchildren. Never heard about it. The white community and the black community kind of just brushed over it. It was something like neither one of them was really proud of. And it was not spoken of. Sid Easley, my good friend in Murray, helped me with this book a lot. He did a lot of footwork, had investigations, helped give me some pictures. Emancipation Day, right before this book, finally finished this book, Emancipation Day, he called me. He said, guess who's going to be in Murray this weekend? And I said, I don't know. He said, Queenie's husband. Queenie was Lou Martin's daughter, who was at the trial sitting in his lap. Her husband is going to be here for Emancipation Day. He's 101 years old. You want to come over? I said, you couldn't keep me away. You could not keep me away. So Sid and I are so excited. I go to Sid's house. We know he's living down with, I forgot the name of the family, but it's basically Lou Martin's grandchildren. And we go down there, and he is, we meet him, sit down to talk to him. And he is so far along in dotage and Alzheimer's, he didn't even know where he was. And so, big disappointment. And we just gave up on that. So that was the frustrating part of it. There's more to this story that I've told you here this evening. And we will probably never know all of it. I'm convinced that Guthrie Duguid was guilty of having an affair with Lou Martin's wife. I'm equally pretty well satisfied that she may have been willing. And I think that's a lot why the black community doesn't talk about it. I think the white community was ashamed of Guthrie Duguid. I think the black community may have been ashamed of her, and they just buried it. And the thing of the heroics with A.O. Stanley just faded away. In fact, you don't ever read anything about it. I stumbled on that when I was writing Flames in the Wind. When I did the biography of A.O. Stanley, and it almost sounded like I stumbled into it. But it's a tremendous story. It's a dramatic story. And a lot of it we don't know about and may never be told. Anyway, I'm going to open it up for questions. Andrew.
How did you come up with the title?
A Distant Light. That's a good question. You know, a lot of it had to do with racial justice and how we've been striving in the book. If you read about it, a lot of the background is the terrible ordeal this state and the South went through in race relationships, the atrocities, the lynchings, the terrible things we went through. And we kind of have progressed up to a point at this stage where we at least have a governor that will come down here and demand justice and stand up for a black man accused of killing a white man. We at least have a semblance of justice, a trial rather than a lynch mob. It's a step forward. You see what I'm saying? It's a step forward. It's an imperfect step, but it's not far enough. We have the distant light that we're still looking for. So we moved from this story into the second part of my book, which I haven't even touched on, and that was, as Bobby told you, Ned Breathitt, 50 years, who met A.O. Stanley, who had a conversation with A.O. Stanley, and he passed the torch of civil rights. And so Ned Breathitt had the first civil rights bill passed in the South. It keeps progressing, see? We're still following in that distant light. And I think I started off with saying a distant light does not illuminate the way, a distant light does not warm the frigid night, but a distant light offers hope. So that's where the distant light came from. Is it true? Distant light doesn't warm you at all on a cold night. It doesn't really provide any illumination. What does it do? There's that filling station, by golly. Yeah. Other questions? They tell me I got 5 minutes. Does that mean that I flopped through a trap door in 5 minutes? Or does that mean they just cut off and we keep going? Okay. Your question might get cut off the video in mid-sentence, but that's fine. Questions? Thank you. Thank you for coming. If you lose money by being here tonight, Jeff Lowry will reimburse you. But nobody can reimburse you for your time. Sorry. You've wasted the last hour, folks. You might as well just get rid of it. Yes, ma'am.
In the book, and because I read the book, and in the book and tonight, you mentioned that maybe his wife was a willing participant.
Yeah, I'm just a guess.
Did she have a choice? She was a black woman. He was a powerful black man. Did she have a choice?
Yeah, well.
Did she really have a choice?
I don't know.
I'm not sure she had a choice.
May not have. But it's odd, a little bit odd to me. She worked at the Rudy's Cafe on the Court Square in Murray. It was in existence then. That's where Queenie worked. Her daughter worked. I don't know. I just know that there's no one would talk about could not get anything from primary source. Everything I wrote in this book came from newspaper accounts, and of course I had some interviews with Randy's dad, who probably heard some of his stories from his father. I had a few sources who were helpful, but not much. In most instances, no, they didn't have much of a choice.
That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
Are you working on another book?
Am I working on another book? I've been asked by the University Press to write another book, and they want a biography, but hell no. I sound like a lot of work. And I'm still working. I still got a day job. I do a lot of writing, opinions, and reading. But a biography, we need a biography of A.O. Stanley. I mean, I've only told you one facet of A.O. Stanley. There's some other facets, and I'll tell you this briefly, although we're going to be cut off from the video. This is 1917. What happened in 1917? What monumental thing happened? World War I. Germany. There was anti-German hysteria across this country and in Kentucky. And the legislature, knee-jerk reaction. Anybody familiar with knee-jerk reaction these days? In a knee-jerk reaction, they outlawed the teaching of the German language in the public schools. Well, there's parts of Kentucky even now, and then for sure up in northern Kentucky, heavily German populated, and they teach school in German language then. And A.O. Stanley looked at it and he said, "This is crazy. We're not at war against the German language. We're not at war against the German people. We're not at war against the German music. We're at war against the German tyrant." So he vetoed it. Oh, my gosh. They were going to hang him. They hung him in effigy across the state. It was a terribly, terribly courageous thing he did. And they didn't override it. So that he would, and that was in Flames in the Wind. See you, Philip.
Good.
Thank you.
Good job, Bill.
Okay. We're going to have an altar call here in a minute. An offering. In my book, Flames in the Wind, of course, it was a story when I started out talking about West Kentuckians. It's a story of courageous West Kentuckians. And he was in that book. He's from, A.O. Stanley's actually originally from Shelbyville, but he moved to Henderson and married Sue Soper. Ned Breathitt, I spent a lot of time with Ned Breathitt for this book. He met A.O. Stanley one time at the Frankfurt Hotel. I also lost a good friend about 3 weeks ago, David, Chief Justice Palmore, who died about 3 weeks short of his 100th birthday. And his mind was as sharp when he died as it was 30 years ago. And he remembered A.O. Stanley. John Palmore's from Henderson. And he remembered A.O. Stanley, running to A.O. Stanley in Washington. A.O. Stanley ran on the platform. He was for women's suffrage, and he was for a lot of unpopular causes. Any other question? My wife's sitting in the back. She's doing this. Yeah. So don't pay any attention to her. If you have any questions, I'll pay for that when I get home.